just over 2 years ago, Port Vale were celebrating a 3-0 League Two playoff final victory over Mansfield Town to send them into League One. The euphoria as Port Vale looked to be on their way under Darrell Clarke towards Carol Shanahan's ambition of becoming a championship ready club. But that ambition has taken a hit in the last 2 years, because while the Vale had a solid first season back in League One and were never really looked in huge danger of relegation, they did make the controversial decision to part company with club legend Darrell Clarke over conduct reasons. But Andy Crosby, his right-hand man, wasn't quite able to fill Darrell Clarke's boots as in the permanent job, and now it's up to Darren Moore to get the Hamel Road end rocking once again in Burslem and get Port Vale back on the right track. Can they do that this season, or will it be more of a rebuilding campaign for the Vale? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing and much more on this Summer Deep Dive. Yes, welcome along to the latest EFL Debate Summer Deep Dive, one of 72 we're doing across the EFL between mid-June and mid-July. Already uploaded, a few uploaded for League Two to YouTube and Spotify, so go and check those out, get subscribed, and maybe even drop us a rating once you're done with this one. For now, delighted to be joined by Scott, aka Picardy Breezer, from the Vale fan base. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Just reflect for me on last season's relegation.
It was a tough one to take, really, but I think given the way that the previous season had ended, when we decided to kind of keep the in-house sort of theme going and recruit sort of Andy Crosby to replace Darrell Clarke, you kind of almost got the sense that it was coming. I think a lot of the summer recruitment kind of gave us a little bit of optimism initially, but I suppose initially the issue was that we didn't sign a striker. The difficulties that we had in doing that were really, really well documented, and you could tell sort of certainly in the early season results that we had that, you know, a clinical forward was really the missing piece of the puzzle. You know, we were playing some fantastic football. Games were being dictated by that sort of duo of Ollie Arblaster and Alfie Devine in the middle of the park. Sure. Like, we were playing some absolutely incredible stuff, but like we just weren't finishing chances. We were losing a lot of games by the odd goal, and goal scoring was a huge problem. And all the stats essentially showed that. Obviously, in January, we then lost both of the loanees. Obviously, Arblaster went and got game time with Sheffield United in the Premier League, which just shows you how good he was. Yeah. And then Alfie Devine was tried by his parent club Spurs in the Championship with Plymouth. Obviously, that didn't quite work out. That was a massive hit to us. The replacements, Jensen Weir and Dangor, never really hit it off at Vale Park. And then again, that elusive striker just didn't come through the door in the summer. In the January transfer window, and ultimately that's what took us down. And I know obviously after the window finished, and there was a little bit of hope that Darren Moore might get a tune out of the players that we had, but it sort of became obvious pretty quickly that, you know, he was dealing with a squad which was extremely low on confidence, extremely bereft of any sort of real quality in the final third. And like I say, ultimately it was we gave it a little bit of a go in the end. There was a little bit of life in us in the final sort of 10, 12 games, but ultimately it just wasn't enough.
Yeah, sure. I think what we saw from the Shanahans when they first came in, and certainly when they appointed Darrell Clarke, is there was a real there was an identity about Port Vale in terms of the culture that he wanted to create. And I think with Darrell Clarke, it's always best when he has a core of leaders. And I think when you look back to the 21-22 side, there are strong characters throughout the team, and I think that was a huge factor behind the promotion. But what I think, one of the reasons why I think you experienced your problems last season, Scott, is maybe there wasn't a clear stylistic alignment throughout the club. So there's certainly a cultural set of expectations, but there isn't a stylistic set of expectations. And I looked through Mike Bagley, who's an excellent Port Vale journalist, and his sort of Substack. And one of the things that was really interesting is he spoke in his sort of player-by-player review about some players who did really well in the Andy Crosby more possession-based style, with like, for example, the ex-Plymouth Argyle, Conor Grant, left wing back, and maybe Funzo Ojo in midfield. And then there's plenty of other players who did better under Darren Moore with his more direct style, aka Nathan Smith being one of them. But what I think for me, what Port Vale need to do is establish a real clear playing identity that goes beyond the sort of what you want from a cultural point of view in terms of work ethic, but actually from a stylistic point of view as well. I think that's going to be huge if you want to make the progress that you want to be, which is to become a championship ready club.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think we're going to see that sort of really come into fruition this year. I mean, I think it's clear what Darren Moore wants. I mean, he wants to play that kind of direct football. He wants to bring in wide players who are going to be getting crosses into the box and sort of hitting the big man. And I think with certainly two of the signings that we brought in already this summer in Ronan Curtis and Jaden Stockley, you're starting to see kind of where we're going in terms of that stylistic side of things. I wasn't necessarily against the possession football that we were playing before, but I think the reasons why that fell down were obviously the lack of a clinical finisher, but also the fact that on the defensive side of things, we were playing sort of that system with wing backs who were essentially square pegs in round holes. Now, obviously, Conor Grant, obviously very, very good footballer at Plymouth, very, very highly rated. I don't think left wing back suited him. Left midfield and a midfield.
I think it does when he's got players who can combine with him. So if I look at his time at Plymouth Argyle, and they had a lot of success down that left hand side over a number of seasons. He had a left centre back called Macaulay Gillespie, who he combined with. He had Danny Mayer sometimes drifting out to the right and sort of cutting inside, and then he had a striker called Ryan Hardy that was often running the channels. So he's a very technical footballer, Conor Grant, and I can see why you'd think that doesn't translate so well to a wing-back role as opposed to central midfield. But I actually think it depends so much on him having runners around him, and I think again it depends so much on the system, and maybe he didn't quite have that at Port Vale because the personnel, there wasn't sort of that alignment in terms of recruitment and in personnel and how to create the right circumstances for him. So for me, that could have been the issue at play there.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think he always looks uncomfortable sort of playing kind of like that role, certainly in the latter stage of the season. And I think maybe it was the personnel around him, because if you look at the back three, essentially, that we were playing throughout the majority of the season, I mean, it was very, very unsettled. We were consistently chopping and changing it, both under Crosby and also under Darren Moore as well. It was only in sort of the final few sort of games where we picked up a little bit of form and then tailed off towards the end that, you know, we actually stuck with a settled sort of three at the back. And that was a massive, massive problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned three at the back there, Scott. I've kind of been looking at the squad at the moment, and I suppose initially I assumed that it would be a 3-5-2 of sorts, because that's what Darren Moore played at Sheffield Wednesday, and that's what he played at Port Vale as well. However, the signing of Ronan Curtis, who you're not signing someone of Ronan Curtis's quality, because he's, a few years ago, this was a top-end League One footballer. He wouldn't have come cheap. You're signing a player of Ronan Curtis's quality. He's not really an obvious fit for a 3-5-2, which makes me wonder if you're either going to go for 3-4-3 or you're not going to operate with a back three at all and might play with more traditional wingers.
Yeah, I think with the number of centre-halves that we certainly still have contracted at the club, and the fact that we probably do need to tweak the defence a little bit in terms of the quality we have anyway, I think 3-4-3 is certainly going to be an option that he'll consider. For me, I think it's going to be either 3-4-3 or 4-2-3-1. So there is going to be a way that you're going to fit wingers into the equation. It's just a case of whether or not he sticks with that back three. But I think with the amount of defenders that we have contracted, unless we start to see some departures from those under-contracted players, you'll imagine that we'll see the three at the back feature at some point in the season to come.
Yeah, I suppose with if you're going to flip between 3-4-3 and 4-2-3-1, which, well, to be honest, we'll know more about what Darren Moore's planning formationally when it comes to pre-season. But I suppose speculating about it now, what tends to help if you want to go between two formations is to have a fullback that can play as a wing back, a fullback that can play as a wide centre half, a wing back that can play as a winger, and then a wide forward that can play as a number 10, and things, players who can sort of flip between multiple positions, that versatility is always helpful. So I think that's going to be a really important thing for Port Vale to recruit for. So I'm sure we'll come back to that. I wanted to ask you, Scott, about Connor Ripley and the season he had between the sixth last season.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword with Ripley, because on the one hand, extremely good shot stopper, exactly what you want in a goalkeeper and exactly what we lacked in our first season back in League One, where sort of Aidan Stone, the typical number one that year, was found wanting a little bit. But I think certainly as the season wore on, it seemed as if Ripley's distribution progressively got a little bit worse. Maybe sort of it wasn't quite sort of matching in with what Darren Moore was looking to do. I think there were a lot of balls just going out of play. There were a lot of situations where there was just a little bit too much on those direct balls forward, and certainly we weren't playing with a forward that was capable of actually holding the ball up and getting us further up the pitch. We've now got that in Jaden Stockley, so hopefully, like I say, we'll start to see that remedy itself. But also, I think a lot of fans have sort of got on his back a little bit around sort of his attitude. I mean, sometimes he maybe sort of distribute the ball a little bit awkwardly, put a defender into trouble. That defender then loses possession and it leads to a shot on goal. And then obviously Ripley's then essentially just he's essentially just bollocking his defenders for making a mistake. So there are a few that sort of maybe aren't too sure about whether he actually trusted the defence in front of him and weren't too sure whether he was comfortable there. And I think that sort of rings true a little bit. But obviously with, the post-mortem done now and a new season ahead, I think that situation is going to naturally remedy itself, because from everything that he's sort of been saying on social media, despite the fact that, well, he thought he was coming into a side last season that was going to be challenging a bit higher up the table, alas, ended up getting relegated. He is probably still going to be here next year rather than jumping ship. So I think that situation is naturally going to remedy itself.
Yeah, let's hope that's the case. I suppose, I think, by the way, just to re-emphasise, I do think that you've got one of the best shot stoppers in League Two, if not the best, for next season. So that's going to be a huge plus, I think. In terms of backup goalkeeper is a difficult one to recruit for, because you sort of ideally you want an older goalkeeper that can be a bit of a mentor or a goalkeeping coach or a safe pair of hands to come in for the odd game, someone who's not necessarily going to expect so many games. But I also want to talk about Aaron Davis, who is an academy graduate. He's somebody who the club has offered a professional contract to. From what I can gather, it's not been confirmed that he's accepted that yet. So I don't know if you've got any understanding of whether Aaron Davis is likely to stay on, or whether you think the club's going to move on or keep him on and loan him out, or how do you see that one playing out?
Yeah, I think with that one, it's probably going to be a case of obviously he'll come in as a first year, probably have a spell out on loan, and then sort of come back into the fold a little bit. Where we do have youngsters who are offered contracts, they tend to essentially sign them and then either go out on loan for a short time and then gradually get eased into the first team. So I'd expect him to sign on for sure. The one exception, obviously, being sort of Reece Walters, who, like I say, I'm sure we'll potentially talk about later, but we don't want to digress just yet. There has been some speculation around Smith, the ex-Stockley keeper, coming in as a second choice as well, who's a little bit younger than Ripley. So that could be one that we turn to, which, if that ends up proving to be the case, that would essentially indicate that we're looking to loan Davis out, or at least give him some sort of minutes with the first team and sort of try him in a few cup games maybe.
Yeah, difficult one to recruit for if you're an ambitious goalkeeper that wants to play regularly. But yes, certainly competition for Ripley wouldn't do any harm. So you mentioned that you've got a lot of centre backs under contract for next season, but one of them is Ben Lomax, who's come from the academy. Now, I don't know if you've any idea what side Ben Lomax is likely to play. Is he right-footed or left-footed, or?
Yeah, he's predominantly right-sided, so he actually featured at right wing-back on a couple of occasions last season.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, do you think there's a world where he could come into the right wing-back equation then for next season as a backup, possibly?
Yeah, quite possibly. I know that he got injured. I think he broke his leg or did something towards the back end of last season, so I'm not sure quite when he's expected back, but he is a versatile player who could probably play sort of right side in a defensive three, a back three, or he could play right wing back. Just given obviously the cameo appearances he had last season, there were a couple of games where he shone and did pretty well, but there were others where he looked a little bit exposed and was looking a little ragged towards the end, and that's probably sort of due to his age and due to his physicality and due to the fact that he was up against some really, really good technical players in League One. So I don't know whether he's going to be one of those players that we turn to on a consistent basis to do a job in League Two, certainly if we're looking to compete at the top end of the league. But I think it will be a season where we do start to blood him in, give him some first team appearances, providing, of course, he's back to fitness and he's looking like the player that we know he can become.
Yeah, I guess we might as well touch on the academy, because I think for the club to make the progress that it wants to over the next 5 years, Scott, it's got to try and develop a few players. And I look at it, I think you've got quite a good opportunity to do that now, because you've got Bailey De Pepper who's come in, and I'm sure we'll come to talk about him in more detail in the attacking section, but just generally, you've got Ben Lomax, who you've mentioned, you've got Bailey De Pepper, who's under contract, and you've got some of those players who are yet to sign professional terms, especially Jack Shorrock, the left wing back, who's only just turned 17. Some big talent that's starting to come through the Vale Academy, and for me, that gives you a great opportunity to start to develop some of them.
Yeah, exactly that, and it is really, really promising that the academy is really starting to tick, and I think obviously a lot of that is down to some of the work that David Flitcroft did before he left, but also the work that some of the academy staff had put in before that. Obviously, Will Ryder, who still oversees the academy now, deserves a massive amount of credit for the development of those players. But yeah, I mean, it's becoming a real sort of conveyor belt now. I mean, prior to sort of this generation of players coming through the academy, we'd only really seen sort of Nathan Smith and James Gibbons in the last sort of 15 or so years come through and really excel in the first team. So like I say, the likes of James Plant, another success of the academy, and expect him to play a starring role next year. As we spoke about earlier, when you're switching between a 3-4-3 and a 4-2-3-1, you need those versatile players that can play sort of on the wing or as an inside forward or at wing back. He's certainly one of those that's capable of doing that. Very much a Mr. Versatile in the attacking sense. So he's a great one to come through the academy. And obviously Bailey De Pepper's the one that everyone's talking about. It's obviously no sort of strange story to yourself that he's been linked with some top clubs, but I think what the club is trying to do at the moment is essentially sort of keep him on in League Two for just that one more season or half a season, develop him a little bit more, hopefully get some more goals and sort of England youth appearances out of him, and then maybe try and boost his market value that little bit further, because I think for a club like us, I mean, we do need to be developing those players that ultimately are going to be making us a few £1 million a few years down the line, something similar to the windfall that Exeter had for Ollie Watkins when obviously Brentford and then was sold on to Aston Villa. Like, that's what we need to be doing as a club. We need to be doing business like that. And I think he's certainly got the potential to be one of those in the future.
Yeah, let's hope he can do that. So then I want to circle back to the centre-back position. At the moment, you've got Ben Lomax, who we mentioned, can play there. Dan Jones, who I think is one of quite a few players that you might have released if he was out of contract, but nonetheless, he's got an opportunity to sort of rebuild a little bit in League Two. You've got Alex Iacovitti, who is a very physical left-sided defender. Jesse Dabra, who I think did well in the National League before with Halifax, and Nathan Smith, who's not the most cultured on the ball, but he's very much a Vale legend and can be that sort of stalwart and that sort of presence at the back. So, how do you sort of see that centre-back position playing out?
Yeah, so I think in the case of Dan Jones, he probably would have been out of the door if he was able to be released this summer. So I think just from an inkling, he might be one of those players that we look to try and move on before the end of the summer transfer window. With the rest of them, I probably expect them to stay beyond that, providing all are obviously happy to play League Two football. I think Alex Iacovitti was fantastic in League One before his calf injury in the game against Bolton, and then he really, really struggled since coming back to fitness in around about sort of October, November time. So but I think we've seen obviously what he's capable of. Big physical defender, looks really good against League Two opposition in cup matches. So I trust him to do a job at that sort of step down. Nathan Smith, obviously we all know what he can and can't do, what his limitations are. Fantastic sort of defender aerially, fantastic battler, but essentially can't really sort of play out from the back. So again, League Two probably is his level. So again, I'd sort of trust him to do a job, and obviously think he'd be sort of a starting figure in that back three. With Jesse Deborah, it's an interesting one. Did very, very well in the National League, shone at times in League One, but was also exposed in others. But he's one of those players that has a little bit of a long throw on him as a weapon. So if Jones were to leave, I mean, we're not kind of losing that attribute of his, because we've still got that in Deborah. But also he's sort of quite tall and quite physical as well, so he can win the aerial battle. And I think essentially playing in the League Two side that's likely to be higher in the league rather than a League One side that's struggling down at the bottom of the table, I think it's going to be a lot better for him to kind of build his confidence in a side like that. So I'd expect him to get some games under his belt next season as well, whether or not we sort of make sort of wholesale additions to that defence.
What do you think that the back three that starts on the opening day, Scott, exists in current personnel, or do you think there'll be another first choice defender coming in?
I think we might bring in one or two more, and I think what we will see is a couple of additions, and then maybe two of the three that we've just mentioned featuring. I think it's most likely to be Smith and Deborah, probably. And then obviously Iacovitti is one of those who will probably come into the fold to sort of close games out.
Okay, yeah, we'll see. I mean, I imagine Alex Iacovitti would probably feel like he wants to try and start regularly if he can have a really good pre-season and regain that fitness side, because I think he can be a commanding centre half at this level. But I think you've already got a few decent options there, so that's a good starting point. I wanted to look at the bigger contract situation, because you were only able to release 3 players last season, Scott, which is quite unusually few after a relegation. And like I alluded to with Dan Jones, I didn't mean to sort of single him out, because I actually think there's probably a few players in there that the club might have made a decision on if they weren't under contract. Do you think that's going to make things harder in terms of recruitment, because you're going to need to put as much effort into getting players out of the door and possibly paying the difference at times with that, or in other cases holding on to players and having to work with them rather than letting them go, and that could maybe limit a little bit what you're able to do in other areas?
Yeah, I think there'll be some individuals that we may not necessarily want to keep at this point, but we will persist with in League Two, kind of because we've not really got much of a choice to. And then there'll be others who we know they probably won't play any part going forwards, and they'll probably be out the door before the summer finishes. Obviously, I won't single individuals out in that sense, but I will say that it probably does make the situation a little bit harder. I don't think it necessarily inhibits us from going and actually spending money on players, because we paid an undisclosed fee for Jaden Stockley today.
Big wages on Curtis, as we mentioned as well.
Yeah, but I also think that it does limit your ability to actually build a squad as well. And I think that's why there might be a little bit of patience required, because it could take, like I say, if there's a near miss next season, I mean, it's quite obvious that it's going to take that extra year to really build the squad that obviously Darren Moore wants. So I think that's got to be bared in mind. But I think it is right of Port Vale fans to expect a significant improvement on the season we've just seen.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. The right wing back spot is interesting to me, Scott, because Tom Sang, some uncertainty over his best position. I guess the fact that the midfield area looks very competitive at the moment, as we'll come on to, suggests that his place in the squad is going to be might be right wing back. You've also got Ben Lomax there, but there's also the question whether are Tom Sang and Ben Lomax going to be at the level you need if you want to be competitive this season? So what would your take be on that?
I think Sang's one of those players where he may do better in League Two against less technical players. However, in League One, he massively struggled at right wing back. Was left exposed many a time. There were a lot of balls going in behind him that led to us conceding goals. So he was really found wanting in that position. And I think, whereas he's obviously quite an athletic player, I mean, he didn't really look comfortable there in League One. That might be different in League Two. But I think his best position probably is a right-sided midfielder in a midfield three. Can I see us playing that next season? Potentially, if we go with a 4-2-3-1 with two deeper line midfielders. But otherwise, I don't think we should essentially sort of tweak the squad just to accommodate him. But I think he will be. He's being under contract and being somebody who featured quite a lot under Darren Moore. I do think he'll be one of those players that will be featured in the squad, even if it is as a squad player next year. With regards to some of the other players, I mean, obviously Lomax we've covered, but obviously one that I think should be mentioned as well is Mitch Clark, who obviously didn't play much football last season with regards to injuries. But I think if Moore trusts him to, get a good pre-season under his belt and prove his fitness, he's one that we could see next year in that position as well. But I think obviously fitness is going to be do or die for him in that respect.
Yeah, of course. I actually had Mitch Clark in my notes as being more left-sided, but he actually can play either side. You're quite right. So, I mean, hopefully, he probably struggled a bit last season, Mitch Clark, because of the injuries that sort of scuppered him a little bit. But I think, as Vale fans will know, he can be. He's a very capable wing back or fullback. So hopefully he can have a really big season in League Two, because I think he's more than good enough at that level. Let's come on to central midfield. I've marked it as central midfield / the number 10 spot because it could be that you play 4-2-3-1. At the moment, you've got Ethan Chislett, you've got Ben Garrity, you've got Jason Lowe, you've got Funzo Ojo, you've got Ryan Crosdale. That's 5 players right there. Plant can play midfield as well. So a lot of competition. Now, I suppose you'd say that's for 3 places, possibly, depending on whether it's 3-4-3 or 4-2-3-1. And you might consider Jason Lowe to play in defence. But still, it looks like a pretty competitive area.
Yeah, so I suppose the beauty of Jason Lowe is that he is also very, very versatile. So I think he plays sort of right in a back 4 at times for Salford. So he's obviously going to be an option to play there. Very dependable player at League 2 level. Featured in a back 3 for us regularly last season. Didn't quite look convincing as a central defensive midfielder, though. But again, that was League 1. In League 2, like I say, it could be a little bit different. So I expect Lowe again to feature as a squad player next year. Would I start him? Probably not. Certainly in the central defensive midfield position. I do expect Ryan Crosdale to start. I mean, he was that kind of player we were missing last season. Somebody to break play up. That kind of perfect sort of player to kind of just sweep up at the back in front of that defence. Obviously, really highly rated at Stockport. Probably, I know Stockport fans say that he's probably no higher than sort of like top end of League 2, might be a bottom end League 1 player, but kind of he's exactly what we need if we want to get out of this league. With Funzo Ojo, I mean, he was much maligned at times after Andy Crosby's departure last season, just because of it seemed like his attitude was a little bit off under Darren Moore at times. And obviously, when you're in a relegation battle, you need players really kind of pulling their sleeves up and sort of mucking in. And it seemed like that wasn't really what he was down for doing. So I don't know whether Funzo Ojo is one of those players where he might not want to play in League 2. The club might look to move him on, might look to sell him. So I think there's a big question mark over his future. But I'd expect him to be playing in a League 2 side, providing obviously his attitude was right and his commitment to the club was there. And then with regards to Ethan Chislett and Ben Garrity, I mean, I think they're probably 2 of the first names on the team sheet, providing they're here beyond the summer. If the club wanted to cash in, I couldn't obviously blame them for doing so, providing the money was right. But obviously, everyone knows how good Ben Garrity is. Fantastic as a central midfielder when he needs to rat about and break things up. Fantastic as that number 10 getting on the end of things and scoring goals, especially in League 2.
Scott, can we just explore that? Because if you play 40, does 4-2-3-1 bring more out of Ben Garrity than 3-4-3? Because it gets him to play in a more of a freer pressing role. Whereas if you play 3-4-3, you've got to play him presumably in one of those 2 deeper midfield spots, unless you play him as sort of a false 9, like I think he's done once or twice in the past, but generally midfield. But that would require a greater level of discipline out of possession, which I'm sure he can do. But
okay, just lost you there for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, which bit did you last hear, Scott? Hello? You there?
Yeah, just lost you there for a second ago. Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sure. So I was talking about Ben Garrity. Do you think he fits better into a 4-2-3-1 because there's a 10 role available to him than maybe he might in a 3-4-3?
Yeah, definitely, and I think that probably is Ben Garrity's best position. I mean, he's one of those players where like he can do the dirty work in that deeper role, but he's so much more valuable when he can get on the end of things and be that late arriver in the box. So I think you would get more out of him in that role, and I don't think it would necessarily shoehorn Ethan Chislett out of the side either, because quite often last season we saw him drifting wide or even starting in one of the wider roles. So there'd still be a place for him in the side as well. So I do think you probably see the best of Ben Garrity in the 10, but if we needed to play that 3-4-3 and then maybe have sort of Chislett and Curtis as the wide players ahead of him around Jayden Stockley, I still think, providing you've got like a Crowsdale in there who can solidify and allow Garrity to kind of be that box-to-box player, you'd probably still get something out of him. Maybe not as much in terms of the goals he might score, but I still think you'd see quite a lot of quality from him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you're thinking maybe Chislett, so you're thinking Garrett. So if it's 4-2-3-1, you're thinking Garrity and Crowsdale. So Crowsdale as your ball winner, Garrity is the box to box, and then you were saying Chislett out wide, and then who is the number 10 that you were thinking there? Sorry.
No, so in a 4-2-3-1, I'd probably have Garrity as the 10. So I'd think about, or potentially you could have even Garrity playing deeper with Crowsdale and then maybe have James Plant in there, maybe move him inside. Right. You could have Chislett as the 10. You could have Plant wide. Like there's a lot that you can do with it, because I think a lot of those players are quite versatile and interchangeable. But I think a non-negotiable next season is we're going to have essentially a central defensive midfielder in there, because we lacked it so much last season, and it told in the amount of goals that we conceded. So, like I say, Crowsdale was one signing that I really, really liked. I mean, he's exactly that sort of player that we lacked at the back end of last season, especially. So I think he'll be one of those that features quite heavily. Whether we bring in somebody else of that mould, just in case, we do feel the bite of injuries and suspensions, I suppose, obviously we'll see. But again, I suppose a question mark over that as well is Funzo Ojo's future at the club, because when he, is playing and he is working hard and he's playing to the best of his ability, he's not afraid to throw a tackle in, and he's not afraid to break things up, but also be that ball player. But it's whether we see the best out of him in terms of work rate in League Two.
Yeah, I think for me with Funzo Ojo, his better form definitely came under Andy Crosby. And for me, if I think of Funzo Ojo at his best, I think of it's him having 80, 90 touches in a game, and him always being that sort of that fulcrum, the one who the play always goes through. And then I could imagine that if he's feeling like the ball's going over his head a lot, he might feel a little bit, what am I doing here now? I'm not saying that to justify the criticisms of his lack of work rate, which Alex Manning has sort of pointed out here. And I totally, I think you should always have pride in your shirt and be putting the work in. And it sounds like Funzo sort of maybe neglected that a little bit at times last season. But I also think there's a mitigating factor there where you are going to get more out of him with a certain style. And I'm not sure that certain style is going to happen under Darren Moore. So then I wanted to come to the attack then, Scott, because I'm guessing that you play with Jayden Stockley as a lone striker. So a 4-2-3-1 definitely brings more out of Garrity, certainly in terms of goals. But I'm wondering if a 3-4-3 might bring more out of somebody like Bailey De Pepper, because it would allow him to play closer to the centre forward in maybe one of those wide forward spots.
Yeah, and I think the need for the versatility in shape is probably another reason why the club is so keen to keep him, because he's proven he can score goals in League One in a struggling side. So we're expecting, they're probably expecting him to maybe break into double figures next season, providing he stays and he has a run of games and stays injury free. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that sort of system will bring the best out of him. It'll probably bring the best out of the likes of Ethan Chislett and Ronan Curtis as well, because they can get right up alongside a striker. Will it be indicative of how many strikers come in the door during the summer as well? We'll see, because we know we really need to rebuild that front line. Stockley is a great start. There's a huge question mark around the future of Ryan Loft at the club, because albeit we've seen a lot of work rate from him at times, we've not seen an awful amount of quality. However, he's not got a bad goal record in League Two. Like, we saw that at Scunthorpe, we saw it to an extent at Bristol Rovers as well. So is he going to be one of those where, you know, he gets sort of cast a lifeline as a last chance saloon by Darren Moore? Again, obviously, I suppose only time will tell on that. But we certainly need at least 3 or 4 forwards in. If we
really 3 or 4 forwards, Scott.
I'd say by the end of the season, we probably want to have 3 or 4 on the books for sure.
If you're only going to play one out-and-out striker, though.
Yeah, because I think if we're playing one out-and-out striker, I mean, just to obviously protect them from sort of injuries and sort of, you know, from fatigue and things, you're probably going to have to be thinking about replacing them on around sort of 65, 70 minutes. So you're going to need somebody dependable who's going to come into that role. But also, if you need to go for games, you need to have somebody a little bit different who's going to be able to play off the forward as well. So we do need to bring in somebody perhaps who's a little bit more kind of dynamic, or running behind and is a little bit more different than what we've got. Obviously, Bailey De Pepper, you know, could potentially do that. Obviously, there's been some speculation around us bringing in Rory Payton from Queen's Park up in Scotland. He looks exactly the sort of player who can do that. So maybe that's indicative as to what the game plan is going to be. We might go sort of little and large in some games if we kind of tweak the formation. But obviously, we've got to have the ability to be able to throw the kitchen sink at games when we're 1-0 down as well. And for that, we're going to need to bring in a different type of forward as well.
That certainly makes sense. You touched on Ryan Loft there, Scott, and I think it's fair to say it was a difficult season for Ryan Loft, and on the balance, he probably didn't prove to be that centre forward that proved elusive for Port Vale. At the same time, he did have one of the best individual performances of the season away at Burton Albion and managed to cap it with a goal. Do you think that there's a chance where he could find a few more performances like that one at the Pirelli in League Two?
It's difficult to say, really, because I don't think he's going to find that as a lone striker. Not certainly unless if he plays in a 3-4-3 and you get runners very, very close to him, because his best form at his previous clubs we've seen is playing in a front two. And against Burton Albion, he was playing up front with James Wilson, who worked really, really hard and essentially helped him sort of run that front line. So I think his best form is having somebody right up next to him, and you're probably going to need to play 2 strikers for that. I don't think it's going to be Port Vale's plan A. Is it going to be? Is he going to be one of those players where, like, say, if we're throwing the kitchen sink at things, we bring him on to try and just, you know, chase lost causes and essentially just cause troubles for a tired defence? It could be, and obviously we know he's capable of scoring goals in League Two. Essentially, I suppose the issue with him is he took a lot of stick off certain sections of the fan base last season. He's essentially got to repair a little bit of that rapport with the fans as well, and some might think maybe it's a little bit too far down the line for that to come now. So it depends whether the club kind of makes a decision on him, really. But for work rate, he's a player that I've always quite liked. I mean, he's always kind of run his bag off. He's chased lost causes. But in terms of quality, I mean, certainly at a League One level, he was just lacking that little bit. And obviously, he's never really been a prolific goal scorer. So it's how you get the best out of him, really.
Yeah, hopefully Port Vale can do that. But he's going to play backup if he does stay, to start the season at least, because you've brought in Jaden Stockley. Stockley and Ronan Curtis are 2 pretty expensive signings based on their sort of pedigree at a higher level. You wouldn't have brought them in without having a few quid to pay, and it suggests to me, Scott, that there is going to be, and you mentioned this at the top of the show, could be a bit of a crossing style where you have Ronan Curtis, you know, getting the ball wide to him and then getting crossed into the box for Jaden Stockley. So it looks like the system could be designed around getting the best out of Jaden Stockley, helping him score goals, but also hold the ball up for other players. And I guess if you play to his strength, he can be effective at this level.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we were trying to get that out of Uche Pizu last season. And essentially, obviously, he's a player that is capable of holding the ball up, but isn't necessarily great on the ball, and also is a little bit immobile, maybe due to his size. I think when you have a player like Jaden Stockley, it alleviates all those issues, because for a big lad, he is mobile, he will score goals, and he will get on the end of things. So obviously, it was important to bring in a striker like that, and we managed to do it, which is fantastic. And I think given the service from the wide players, he will score goals for us. The issue is, I mean, obviously when that plan A doesn't work, or say something does happen to Jayden Stockley, what are we going to have in reserve? And I suppose that's where, you know, we do need to do a little bit more in the recruitment side of things for that front line.
That makes a lot of sense. So talk to me about where you think Port Vale are at from an ownership and a structural point of view, because I think we'll both agree, first of all, what Port Vale have right now under Carol and Kevin Shanahan is absolutely miles ahead of anything you had under the previous ownership regime. I think that's a given. Do you think there's things that can be done better?
I think so. Certainly, over the last 12 months, we've seen that communication from the club hasn't been the best, and they pledged to improve that. So, like I say, hopefully we'll see the fruits of that in the months to come. But I think as well, there's maybe been a little bit of a sense from the fan base that we kind of muddled through last season at times. Like we didn't bring a striker in. We were maybe a bit hesitant to spend money. Also recruiting an assistant manager as the permanent last summer in Andy Crosby. So I think last season there was almost a sense that, you know, we'd done things on the cheap to an extent, and now all of a sudden we're kind of doubling down and throwing a little bit of resource at it again. Why that is, one can only speculate. I suppose there's a lot of sort of linking to the sale of Synectic Solutions, the owner company of Port Vale, midway through the season, conveniently just after the January transfer window, which could speak volumes. Yeah. So. Like I say, maybe that's the whole reason behind why all of a sudden, you know, there's resource available, and, you know, we've gone and signed Jayden Stockley, probably the striker that maybe we were missing this time in January.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I also feel the club. You mentioned David Flitcroft did some good work with the academy, and I'm sure there's been some summers where his recruitment has been spot on. In fact, you could argue 2023. At the same time, my understanding is that Flitcroft was only in the building a couple of days a week on a sort of full-time salary, and you just wonder whether Carol and Kevin might have been a little bit naive to sort of accepting that level of contribution from their director of football, and whether you'd have wanted someone on that kind of money to actually be a bit more of a presence on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think there certainly was a lot of naivety, and I think maybe that stemmed from the fact that, you know, he recommended them bring Darryl Clark in. Also, we were promoted at the first time of asking, so that gave him a lot of credit in the bank. But I think what sort of made it all come unstuck to an extent is the fact that David Flitcroft was a manager at Bury, very, very good in League Two, but was found wanting a little bit in League One, despite having quite an expensively assembled squad. I think that also rang true for his time as a director of football at League One level. At League Two level, extremely effective in who he helped bring in for Darryl Clark. Very, very good recruitment, both in the summer and the January, in the 21-22 season when we were promoted. A little bit sort of rushed recruitment, sort of when it came to the summer, when, you know, we won the playoffs and we had that sort of shorter pre-season, had to go straight into the thick of it in League One with only a couple of strikers in the building. But then we hastily assembled a few players towards the end of August, which got us to ninth in the table. And then since that point, it's been an absolute disaster, really. So I think it came to the end of the road, really, for David Flitcroft naturally, and you sort of just got the impression that, you know, he'd kind of gone past his sell-by date.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that Flitcroft has the experience with Flitcroft has put the club off a director of football model? Because I would argue, I still think that it can work with the right people. I don't necessarily think David Flitcroft was the right person, but I look at sporting directors, maybe especially sporting directors that have a more scientific and modern approach to the game, as opposed to maybe older managers and that side of things. But do you think the club should look at going in that direction, or do you think they've appointed Darren Moore as part of the long-term plan, and he's going to oversee the operation as well as being on the touchline?
Yeah, I think from the fans forums I've been to recently, I think the latter certainly is what the club plan to do. So Darren Moore is going to be heading up the footballing operation side of things, as well as managing the first team. So he is going to be the one that handles the recruitment. And I think when you do have a name like Darren Moore, I suppose what that does then is if you do have a director of football in place, it probably limits their role more towards just sorting contracts out, which essentially a club CEO can potentially do, because a name like Darren Moore, given obviously his managerial credentials, what he's established at bigger clubs, is probably going to be enough to attract players to Port Vale anyway. And I think that's the whole reason why he was brought in, and maybe one of the reasons why we saw David Flitcroft sort of depart towards the end of last season, is maybe not just because his time at Vale naturally ran its course, but also maybe, I don't think there were necessarily loggerheads between him and Darren Moore, but there was maybe a sense that, you know, Darren Moore wanted to be more hands-on with the recruitment side, and naturally that kind of took a lot of the emphasis off what would have been Flitcroft's role.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. I think it's difficult to judge Darren Moore from his form in the last third of last season, because so many problems. There was sort of a build-up of problems before him, and while it wasn't a great start under Moore, the performances did improve and results did improve towards the end, but maybe a bit too late. But I guess it's difficult to judge him too much. But did you have any sort of impression as to what sort of contribution he can make to the Vale?
Yeah, like you saw signs, I think, and I think everybody had to kind of give him a little bit of slack in the sense that he was dealing with a squad that was not only sort of bereft of quality, but also very low on confidence as well. And I think you saw in the game against against Fleetwood Town, especially where, you know, we're 2-0 up in a key relegation fight. You lose a goal in the 89th minute and then end up drawing the game and could potentially have lost it. Even Darren Moore himself has come out and said since then that that's when he said he knew the scale of the problems that Port Vale had. So, like, I think he was always fighting a losing battle from that point. Like I say, it's very difficult to kind of, you know, build confidence in the players when, you know, maybe there's a little bit of a difference in attitude to what you'd like to see, but also a massive lack of quality. And ultimately, he was dealt a bad hand with both of them. But there's no doubt in obviously what he's done previously in football and what he's achieved at other clubs. Not necessarily all big spending clubs as well. I know obviously he's not dipped into League Two before, but I can't imagine, obviously people can correct me if I'm wrong, he had immense resources when he was at Doncaster, but he still got them into a very respectable top 6 position in League One. So it shows what he can do even with sort of lesser resources to what you get at somebody like a Sheffield Wednesday.
I disagree a little bit, because I think at Doncaster, you're right, they didn't have an enormous budget, but they did have a lot of quality brought into the loan markets. And for me, my feeling on Darren Moore, I think he has a lot of strengths. One of which is his sort of high-profile managerial career so far, which is a big tick in the box, like you mentioned, for attracting players. The other strength I think he has is his game plans for one-off individual matches. Bring a very high level of professionalism and detail. So for individual match preparation, I think is very strong. But I also feel like he has certain limitations as an in-possession coach, and I've never been hugely impressed or overly enamoured by a Darren Moore side from a footballing point of view, in terms of, oh wow, I can see lots of different patterns of play coming together, and they're creating lots of chances that way, because I think they've often relied on individual quality and sometimes looked a little bit imbalanced, but been able to get through that by having really good individual players. And I worry a little bit about Port Vale when the playing field is kind of levelled from where he was when he was at West Brom and Sheffield Wednesday, whether he'll still be able to have that same impact. So I'm not maybe as big on Darren Moore as other people might be, and I don't look at him and think he belongs well above League Two level. But I do think he has certain qualities, and hopefully he can put them to good use.
Yeah, so I think a lot of sort of the criticisms of Darren Moore last season, despite obviously the hand he was dealt, was his kind of in-game management. Like I say, we'd be in good positions in games. We'd have to make a couple of changes for one reason or another, and then we'd end up either conceding the lead and drawing or end up losing the game. So that was essentially, unless it was an enforced substitution, which it was never quite clear whether it was or not by the end of the 90 minutes, that was a massive kind of question mark over him. I think also, again, maybe stylistically, nobody really saw exactly what we were trying to do. I mean, we kind of gone away from the possession-based football that Crosby was playing to kind of something more direct when it maybe didn't match the players that we have. So I agree. I don't necessarily think we're going to be playing a lot of slick passing football next season, but I think you'll see a lot more directness to Port Vale, and I think that's essentially been shown in the signings that we made as well already. So you've got a defensive midfielder who's going to break things up in Ryan Croasdale. We're looking at bringing in wide players like Ronan Curtis that are going to be getting balls in the box, and we've got to sign a big striker. So I think that kind of tells you everything as to what we can expect next season.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, Scott, we're a bit tight for time because my office is closing in a few minutes. So I'm kind of going to make these last three questions quite quick fire. So if you could sort of respond with a few words or a couple of sentences, that would be great. First question is, to condense everything we've talked about on this podcast, what will be the big reason for you to believe that you'll meet your ambitions for next season and finish in the top 7?
The fact that we've made quality over quantity signings this summer so far. I think the 3 that we made have been very good. And I'd rather that than essentially sign double the amount of players who maybe are a little bit unknown or probably won't kind of give us the requisite quality.
That makes a lot of sense. What are your reasons for doubt?
The fact that we've got a lot of players under contract at the club that might not necessarily fit into the long-term plan. Where they fit in, we don't know at this point. Is that going to bring a little bit of disjointedness to the side that could be the Achilles heel? That would be my doubt, really.
Okay. And then finally, give me a number between 1 and 10 to denote your level of optimism for the season ahead for right now.
At the minute, it's probably at a 7 because I'm quite happy with the signings that we made so far. And I think we're definitely going for quality over quantity, but we do need more players in the door. And obviously, it's time's kind of running short until pre-season. So kind of who we bring in, who's going to fit into the long-term plan. Obviously, there's a question mark over that. But like I say, the progress has been good so far. But it's how slow we're going to make that progress because it's taken time to bring these guys in. So are we going to have everything we need by the time the season starts? Who knows?
Let's wait and see. Listen, Scott, thank you so much for your insight. I really appreciate your time. Everyone go follow Scott at Picardy Greaser on Twitter or X. Thank you for watching at home. This has been the EFL Debate Summer Deep Dive on Port Vale. Plenty coming up between now and mid-July. So get subscribed to EFL Debate on YouTube and on Spotify, and we'll see you again very soon.